Rahman Rahim. Thanks for inviting me. Awesome. I was going to actually ask you introduce me with the video of me with the Ertugrul music of me doing archery at Karima Foundation. But then I realized that would take too much time and it's too self-absorbed. So I'm gonna try and do. I have an hour, right? Or 40 minutes. I have 40 minutes. I'm gonna try and do an enormous amount of material in that amount of time. So I'm gonna move quickly. I'm also, if you want, I don't know if there's a way for you to share files with the listeners or something, or people who signed up, but I can actually send people this PowerPoint show so they have the information in the PowerPoint show. If you want, I can do that now or I can do that later. Awesome, whatever you think is best.
We have all of the emails of all the people who signed up. So what you can do is just send it to me, and I'll send it out to everybody. And maybe if I could ask Dr. Waymer later as well to send his slides, and then I can send them to
If
everybody, inshallah.
you want to send them later or now?
Well, I'm going to send them later. If
Okay, then I'll do it later. Okay,
okay,
so
perfect.
this presentation, this lecture is going to explain kind of the where the Western view of how we think about history and religion comes from, and since the Western civilization is now a global Western civilization, right? It's globally influential. Um, this is um, kind of in some ways it answers the question, why is it that we, quote unquote we, i.e. people in the modern world, when we think about religion and history in a certain, why do we think about it in a certain way? Why are there certain suspicions? Why are there certain um, assumptions? And this kind of explains where they come from. The purpose of the presentation, which I think is accurate, I mean, it's not kind of a attempt to brainwash you, right? The purpose is to explain how uh, what a lot of people think just is the way the world is naturally is actually not natural, right? It's not our modern global Western view towards history and religion is the result of a specific experience in Western civilization, and it's not at all universal, right? So it relies on certain experiences, certain presumptions, and then sometimes it enforces those presumptions on other situations where they're not accurate, where they end up with inaccurate results. Okay. So let me just get this thing out of my what did I do? Did that go away? Good.
No, we can see the PowerPoint.
Oh, you can still see it.
Roots into the study of the Islamic
Okay.
tradition.
That's good. Interesting. Well, we'll see what happens when I press this button. Nothing happens when I press this button. Let me try. Okay. There we go. Did something just happen?
Yes, yes, I
Okay,
can.
good. All
You're
right.
working.
So it's important to remember why and how Western European and American scholars began to study the Islamic tradition. You see here on the right is a poster from early 20th century French Algeria. Algeria was a French, actually not just a colony, it was actually considered part of France between 1830 and 1962. And this is a poster the French government put up. It says, "Aren't you beautiful? Aren't you pretty? Take off your veil." Right. So it's very important to think about the link between the Western study of Islam and the colonial project and the attempt to create, in some ways, like well-behaved or polite, well-behaved, well-trained Muslims. We can think of the same project today in the shape of progressive Islam that kind of really was kicked into high gear after 9/11. The idea of kind of the depoliticized, de-radicalized, depolitical um, kind of compliant Muslim citizen. So one of the main routes that Westerners and Western scholars took into the study that kind of brought them into contact with the Muslim tradition and Muslims was through colonialism, whether it was the French in North Africa, the Dutch in Southeast Asia after the 1600s, the British in India in the 1700s and onward. Right, this was a main way that these scholars came into contact with Islamic legal heritage, partially because they were oftentimes in charge of or trying to shape legal systems that utilize part of the Sharia, and they had to kind of understand the local customs like Sufi orders and things like that in order to deal with the local populations, but also because it allowed them to try and shape how their local populations understood Islam in order to make them non-threatening, non-political colonial subjects. Another major route was through diplomatics, i.e., essentially the relationship that European states like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Britain, France had with the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. That, the idea of studying Turkish and learning about Islam as a way of kind of dealing with this Ottoman neighbor and competitor they had. And finally, the most important for our purposes. So in a lot of ways, things like if you were going to study kind of Islamic law in the late medieval or early modern period, or Ottoman history or something like that, it would be the first two, or in Islam in South Asia or India, you would be really looking at the first two routes in. But when you talk about the origins of Islam, the Quran, the Hadith, the origins of Islamic law, the early Islamic period, it's really an extension of biblical studies. So basically, and this is very important because what we'll see is that Western scholars had a certain experience in the study of the Bible and the biblical tradition and the classical heritage of Greece and Rome. And then what they did is they essentially assumed that applied to everywhere else in the world and just basically took that kind of cookie cutter approach and just applied it to other. One of the first things they did with it is like, oh, well, let's do this to the Islamic tradition, so we can understand that as well. It also have this kind of notion of the study of world languages. This is an interesting point, which I don't want to spend too much time on, but which I wanted to bring up just briefly, which is that there was, beginning in the 1500s, an interest in Western universities in the study of world languages, especially biblical languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, Arabic, right? There was an idea that you could kind of reconstruct this human Adamic language, like the original language of Adam. And so that was actually a real interest in the origins of languages. And that's one of the first things you see, actually, the British scholars and administrators in India in the late 1700s, people like Warren, I think William Jones was one of them. That's where people like British scholars started to do things like try and reconstruct ancient Sanskrit and things like that. That was sort of a similar enterprise to what German and French and British scholars engaged with in terms of the Islamic tradition, but it was in the kind of Sanskritic Indian tradition. And also it was this idea of kind of going back and uncovering this original great language of human civilization and sort of trying to find the origins of human civilization. So that's another important one. But this also had not necessarily colonial aspects to it, but definitely an air of superiority. So although some figures like Jones, like William Muir, who died in 1905, famous, one of the first scholars to write about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, one of the first Orientalists to do that, he was a really senior and important figure in the British East India Company, and then in the post 1857 rebellion British administration. So there was a lot of overlap between colonial administration and these scholars, but also part of it was, maybe a better intentioned, but still very paternalistic idea of shedding light on these kind of jungles and dark recesses of the globe that Europeans were going to go and kind of apply their. You can think of Indiana Jones in this sense, like the idea that kind of Indiana Jones goes somewhere and kind of figures out the real history of a certain place and kind of rescues the natives who are being oppressed or something like that. The idea that you're going to go and kind of by shedding light, and you can see this very clearly, like you think about, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, or just generally the attitude towards the Muslim world, which is that, we are just trying to liberate these Muslims from their tradition, from their past. If we can explain to them that they have misunderstood their religion or what the actual origins of their religion are, they will be liberated. As we were liberated. This is very important, right? So Westerners aren't doing this because they are racist or something like that. Obviously some people are racist, but it's the idea that we were imprisoned by our tradition. We were imprisoned by Christianity and the church and all this stuff, and we liberated ourselves. And so we want to liberate other people. but it definitely has a paternalistic light. And there was actually, I spent maybe an hour this morning trying to find it. I couldn't find it. I can't remember who said it. I think it's Voltaire, the famous French kind of literateur and thinker and historian. He died in 1778. And he wrote about how, the Muslims didn't really understand the life of the Prophet until, or the Quran until like Westerners did studies of it. This idea that people don't understand their own tradition until Westerners come along and study it and explain it to them. That's a very important notion here. All right. It's weird. I always feel like I'm always looking, if I'm doing this lecture in person, I'd be looking for people raising their hands or looking confused, but I can't do that. So I'm just going to keep going. Okay. Historical critical method, or the HCM. This is what's the term that's generally used to talk about the way that historians, and by that you can mean, historians of anything, of history, of scripture, of religion. I'm just pouring the coffee I made for myself, which I didn't get done in time. This is, I'm going to just go through a couple of important principles, parts of it. The main idea is that through interrogation of sources, of historical sources, texts from the past, fragments of, relics, archaeological ruins, artifacts, we can, as the great German historian, the kind of father of modern history, Leopold von Ranke, who died in 1886, he said, the job of the historian is to find out what really happened. So we have suspicion towards previous historians. So pre-modern historians, the people who wrote, the chronicle of this, or the guy who was the court historian of King Henry VIII, or the Ibn Kathir, or some, medieval Indian historian, or anything like that. We're very critical of them. The default is that we're suspicious of them, that they are trying to mislead us, that they're lying, that they are ignorant or something. But that by applying the correct tools to these sources, and using what we understand about how history works and how humanity works, we can reconstruct the past and figure out what really happened. What were the origins of a religion or a dynasty or a people or a language? Now, but it's very important that this notion that the default is suspicion, right? It's the historical critical method. The fundamental thing is that you are critical of the past, critical of things told to you about the past. That's the founding stone of this approach. But this is very, very important. They are critical of certain things and towards certain people. And this is where the bias comes in, which I'm going to talk about later. They're critical towards about certain things and about certain people, not about other things. Okay. Just imagine this. If I tell you, here's a report, right? A Persian woman, Iranian woman says, I can't stand the hijab. I just want to be free and, express myself. And here's the other report. An Iranian woman says, I like wearing the hijab. This is part of my religion and important part of my faith. And it actually makes me feel protected and ennobled. Which one do you think a Westerner is going to be critical of? Even a scholar is going to be critical of? I don't even need to answer that question. You know the answer. Right? So there's you can see where our biases, although both of those reports are entirely possible, right? People say both of those things. You can hear them with your own ears saying these things, but one of them is going to be treated with suspicion and one of them is not. A couple of really important principles, and maybe these are sort of the foundation stones of the Western foundation pillars of the Western historical critical method. The first one is called uniformitarianism. This is a really weird word. It's a scholar named, I think, William von Leyden came up with it in the 1950s. There's another term as well called the principle of analogy, but we'll go with this one. What this says is that essentially people are always the same. Cultures may differ, languages may differ, hairstyles can change, interest rates fluctuate, things like that. But basically, people are always people. And people are always what? They're always greedy, they're self-centered, they're short-sighted, they're forgetful, right? It's a kind of cynical look at human nature and the assumption that there is a human nature and it's always the same, right? The second is the concept of anachronism. Anachronism is the idea of things being out of place in time. Anachronism is the idea of things being out of place in time. So the idea, imagine if you saw a report that said that when John F. Kennedy was trying to resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis, he the first thing he did is he reached into his pocket, grabbed his mobile phone, and called his brother to try and discuss some option. Immediately, this report is unreliable or something's wrong with it because cell phones didn't exist in the 1960s, right? So that's something that's out of place in time, an anachronism. And finally, the principle of dissimilarity. What this says is that if something goes against what it's kind of like in court when you, one of the things that you can use as an exemption to the hearsay restriction, like normally you shouldn't be allowed to testify about things that you heard other people say. But one of them is statements made against interest. So if you say something that doesn't serve your interest, then it's accepted in court. This is very similar, right? So you accept the report if it doesn't seem to say what the powerful people want it to say. So if someone were making up a story, why would they include this report? It goes against what they're trying to do. So if you're a Christian, if you find a report that says that Jesus said, "I'm not God, I'm not the Son of God, I'm actually just a regular guy. Stop saying this about me and don't get any weird ideas." If you found that in some document, you'd probably think it was true because that's not what Christians would be making up. Okay, so that's a principle of dissimilarity. Now we'll go into these origins. By the way, Awesome, you can tell me when you tell me when we have like 10 minutes left. Okay, I assume
Yeah, no, I'll do that.
Okay, so its origins explain these biases. The origins of the historical critical method explain the biases we'll go into. So the first stream that goes into it is the Renaissance rediscovery of the classics. By here, the classics, I mean the Greco-Roman heritage. Renaissance, of course, is a period, roughly from the late 1300s to through the 1500s in places like Italy, France, England, what becomes Germany, et cetera, et cetera. The second, the Age of Discovery, we know about that. Europeans discovered the Americas and then lots of other places. And third is the Protestant Reformation, which we all know about. It started in 1517, usually is the date given when the Saxon monk Martin Luther begins his protests against the Catholic Church. All right. Okay, first we're going to rediscovery of the Greco-Roman past. This is very important and a lot of material here. I want you to pay attention. Awesome asked me to do this, and I got 40 minutes, so it's quite a challenge. Sense of historical distance. This is very important. Look at this picture, right? This is actually taken from a church in Germany. I took this in the church in Tübingen. I don't know if you can see this, but the glare is really annoying on this picture. But I don't know if you can see this. This is a picture of the crucifixion of Jesus, right? Now, the figure is there. This guy here is wearing like medieval armor. These people are dressed like medieval German peasants, and the background looks like Germany, like rural Germany, right? That's not how people dressed in Palestine in the first century AD, and it's not how the area looked. This is important because medieval Europeans and pre-Renaissance Europeans thought about themselves as continuities of the Roman past. So they were, when you think about things like the Holy Roman Empire, that wasn't some weird claim they were making. Like they honestly thought they were a continuation of the Roman tradition. They were a continuation there was no break. So when we talk about the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, that's a post-Renaissance notion. The notion that there's this intermediary period where there's like a break between kind of enlightenment and rediscovery in the present, and then the ancient past. In the middle is the Dark Ages. That's our perspective. That's a post-Renaissance perspective. That's not how people prior to the Renaissance thought about things. They thought themselves as an extension of those times. What happens in the Renaissance is figures like, and I give you some examples here, Petrarch, who died 1374. He's from Florence. Lorenzo Valla, who's from, I think also from Florence. He died 1457. Desiderius Erasmus, originally from Rotterdam. Rotterdam, but he lived in London. He lived all over not in London, but in England, all over the kind of European intellectual scene. What they understood is when they went back and actually recovered early manuscripts of Roman writers like Cicero or Livy or Pliny, that the medieval Latin of the church and of medieval Europe was like a kind of decadent and decayed version of Latin. It was not the pure original Latin of figures like Cicero, the great Roman orator and statesman who died in 43 BC. It was, and they realized that there's this great distance between them and the classical past. So figures like St. Augustine, who died in 430, and the whole medieval intellectual tradition created a continuity between the classics of Aristotle and Plato on the one hand, Christianity on the other hand, and the medieval kind of Germanic present. So there was a continuity. All these things were melded together: the classical philosophical tradition, Christianity, kind of German, roughly speaking, Germanic culture. These were all blended together seamlessly in one continuity. What these figures like Petrarch realized was that no, that's not the case. People like Cicero, Augustine, and Plato, these people were pagans. They did not believe in God. They were not Christians, right? There was this synthesis actually was made of discordant elements. And thinking about somebody like Cicero and admiring him was to admire someone who's a pagan who existed before Christianity. So they realized what they came up, they sort of started to feel what Nietzsche calls the pathos of historical distance. They started to actually feel like they were disconnected from something. There was a break between them and the past that they wanted to reconnect with. And that was the past of the Greco-Roman tradition. People like, so in the Renaissance, remember that term means rebirth. It's the rediscovery, the rebirth of the classical Greco-Roman tradition that Europeans in France and Italy, especially in the 1300s and 1400s and 1500s, are able to reconnect with via a couple of important sources. One is Muslim learning from Spain, and another one is Byzantine scholars fleeing Ottoman expansion in Anatolia and coming to Europe, right? So that actually gives these Europeans access to works of Aristotle and Plato and all sorts of other classical figures that they had not previously had. And so they have this interest in rediscovering that past. And everything we're going to talk about from now on out is in a way a product of this rediscovery of the Greco-Roman past. In a lot of ways, our modernity is a rebirth of the Greco-Roman worldview, with the addition of an important element, which we'll talk about: progress, the idea of progress. Greeks and Romans didn't think of the world as changing. They didn't think that history began and ended. The world for them was eternal in a lot of ways, for people like Aristotle, certainly. And there was no there was no decline. You guys talked about, Obama talked about a sense of decline. There was no sense of decline. History was just circular. The Wheel of Fortune is not just a TV show. That was a concept that, sometimes this group's up, sometimes that group's up, sometimes this guy fails, sometimes this guy succeeds, but nothing changes in history. It just repeats. No up, no down, right? In general. One important concept that they rediscovered in this process was the notion of an unchanging human nature. And a good example of this is Herodotus, the great, sometimes called the father of history, a great, he was originally from Halicarnassus, modern day Bodrum in Turkey. If you want to go there, you can go there in the summer and go clubbing and then go and try and find, where you think Herodotus's house was or something. He died in, I believe, about 420 BCE, although he lived in Athens. And he wrote a history of the Persian Wars, which is an amazing book. I recommend reading it. But one of the things he says, and it becomes very clear in his book, is that, people don't change. And that actually allows you to figure out what's true and false in stories about the past. For example, the story of the Trojan War. Everyone knows the story of the Trojan War, right? So Paris gets promised Helen because he has to pick between these three goddesses about who's the most beautiful. One of them promises him Helen. He goes to Sparta, steals Helen from her husband, her rightful husband, Menelaus, takes her back to Troy. The Greeks get all pissed off. They go to Troy and they fight a 10-year war to get back Helen, right? Now, what Herodotus says is, I don't think Helen ever went to Troy. He thinks that basically on the way that she got lost, she ended up in Egypt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why does he think she didn't go to Troy? He says people don't fight 10-year wars to keep some woman they stole. So if someone came and said, "Give me back my wife that your prince stole," they would say, "Yeah, actually, I probably should give you back the wife. Yeah, and I'm not going to fight a 10-year war and destroy my city because of this." It doesn't make. He said this doesn't make people don't act this way. Very important concept. People don't act this way. The second is the second element that's rediscovered, and picked up by European scholars in the Renaissance and afterwards is the notion of the historian as the detached and lofty pseudo cynic. So the notion that the historian is above things. People like St. Augustine, historians like Gregory of Tours in the 6th century, the Venerable Bede in the 7th century. He died 735. I think Gregory Tours died 570 around. These are kind of great medieval Christians, or people like John of Salisbury in the 12th and 13th century in England. These were figures who were part of history. They were writing about the history of Christendom that they were part of, right? So there was a progress that they were part of. They weren't looking back on things with a sense of detachment and superiority. They were part of the world that they were describing, a narrative of Christian civilization. Whereas classical historians, not just like Herodotus, but also figures like he was Greek, but he wrote about Roman history. His name was Polybius. He died around 135 BC. Polybius. He says a historian's job is to sometimes criticize his friends and praise his enemies. A historian is above things, right? The historian is above things, and the historian's job is to figure out what actually happened and explain why, and then to show how lessons can be learned from that, right? So that a figure like Cicero, right, is looked back on, and I think of Cicero as the ultimate kind of cocktail party guest. You guys are probably mostly Muslim, so you haven't gone to a lot of cocktail parties. But if you just imagine a figure, I call him the tipsy Nigel. You can imagine like this British scholar who's got like a cocktail and is saying, "Oh, I've just gotten back from Kenya and I was visiting the Maasai," and things like that. And so everything in the world is sort of below them and kind of jokey and kind of worthy of mockery in a little slight gentle way. And everyone else in the world is kind of silly and stupid, and religion and nothing has any meaning, right? Religion, church is all kind of a joke. You go there and maybe you're polite when you're there, but you make kind of jokes about religion. That's very much the perspective of someone like Cicero. He says in one line in one of his dialogues, he says that he never understood how two Roman augurs are people who read they release birds and you see how they fly, and then you kind of read the fates from that. He says he never understands how two Roman augurs can talk to each other without laughing. He said, but that's a big part of Roman public life. So he would never kind of go out and make fun of this publicly. Publicly, he venerates kind of Roman tradition, but privately, he's not making fun of this stuff. This is an important kind of persona that's picked up by Renaissance and post-Renaissance scholars. Skepticism about metaphysics. This is very important. The classical or the kind of medieval Western European tradition is both because it's grounded in the Christian scriptures and in the teachings of Aristotle and Plato. These are both traditions that make very strong claims about metaphysics, about what the nature of reality beyond our senses is. Whether you're Christian or whether you're Plato or Platonic tradition, they have very strong assertions about the nature of reality with a capital R in this now and in the afterlife and before, et cetera, right? Whereas there's this whole tradition in Greco-Roman philosophy called the skeptical tradition. A great example is Sextus Empiricus, who dies in about 200 of the Common Era. And his work is rediscovered in the 1600s and 1700s, becomes very influential in Europe, which is basically saying, look, humans can't actually know anything. We can't know anything about morality. We can't know anything about truth. Basically, morality is just custom. So what's right and wrong in Athens is just what people in Athens think is right and wrong. That's it. And any other discussion about truth and falsehood or what the world is made of or what's going on, what God is, also, this is all beyond our knowledge, beyond our ken. So, in fact, you should focus on this world. And this is a very important, another theme that's picked up is the notion of the skepticism about metaphysical claims and myths and beliefs. And instead of focus on the material world becomes the only thing you can really know about. And it really influential figure is the Lucretius, who's a Roman philosopher who dies in 55 BC. He wrote a poem called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. It's translated in English. You can read it. Extremely influential. For example, Marx wrote his thesis on this guy, Karl Marx. That might tell you something. He thinks religion is ridiculous. He thinks Greek myths are ridiculous. The only thing you can know is the material world around you. And this notion of focus on the material world and also the scientific method of people like Aristotle is picked up in the 16th century, especially in the Italian city of Padua. And that's really the beginning of kind of modern science, modern Western science, is actually a rediscovery of Aristotelian seeds of the kind of scientific method of hypothesis and proving and experiment. And this is an important element in modern kind of post-Renaissance thought. We talked about important figures. We'll discuss them a little bit as well. We already talked about Petrarch, Cicero, Lorenzo Valla. We'll talk about him in a second, and Erasmus as well. You know what? I should have actually, let me tell you something. This is very important. I forgot about it. We talked about a sense of historical distance. One of the things you notice when you have a sense of historical distance is how things have changed. And that's very, 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 very important, because for example, Lorenzo Valla, he discovers when there's this important document called the Donation of Constantine, which allegedly was made by the Emperor Constantine, who converted to Christianity. And I think he died in 337, if I'm not mistaken, of the Common Era. And he writes this will, which essentially gives like a huge amount of temporal power and control over land to the church. And this is like a major pillar of kind of the papal and the church claim to temporal power. What Lorenzo Valla realizes and brings together existing research that had already been done, but he puts it together, and is that some of the words in this document are Latin words that were not in use at the time of Constantine. They were only in use centuries later. So what he says is, this is a forgery. By seeing how anachronism, by looking at anachronism, you can prove forgery and show change in a textual tradition. Erasmus does the same thing with the Bible. So in the New Testament, there's only one verse in the New Testament in 1 John, I think verses 5-7, that talks about the Trinity. Jesus says there are three that bear the testimony in heaven: God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Ghost, I think is the actual text. It's called the Johannine Comma. And what Erasmus did is, by collecting the earliest Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, he said the earliest manuscripts don't have this verse in it. These are actually added in later. Other things, by the way, the story in the you might see in like the Bible movies, when there's the people want to stone a prostitute, and Jesus comes out and says, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Also, Erasmus says this is added in later as well. Very interesting. So this notion of going back to the original sources in the Greco-Roman tradition, you're able to show change through your mastery of the study of language. So, I mean, think about this. That's a huge blow against the textual integrity of the biblical tradition. Okay, second really important kind of thread that goes into the cloth of the historical critical method is the age of discovery. This is very important. And I want you to imagine, think about how blown your mind would be if you discovered 2 new continents, right? People always thought that the world just had this big ocean on the back, the globe was, the world we know of. And then there's this just big ocean on the back and nothing's there. And then, everything that matters is where we are. And they discovered that's not true. There's 2 new continents. And this is very important because it really explodes the biblical, not only the Bible of the geography of not necessarily the Bible, but of the church and of church teachings, but also like the genealogy of humanity. So if if the story of the children of Noah, so Shem's children populate the Middle East, and Ham's populate Africa, and Japheth's children populate the kind of northern realm. Who's in the Americas? Like, how does that happen? How does that fit into this world? And then uh, these people who live there, like, how do you? Okay, if you live in Africa or Asia or Europe, like you could have heard of Christianity. Like in theory, you could be exposed to these prophets and this kind of biblical world that we all know about. But what about these other people? How do we make sense of what they believe and how we're supposed to judge them? Because they're completely cut off from us. They have a totally different history. They're not exposed to the Bible and all these things. So what does that mean about the notion of truth? A famous figure in this case is a French scholar named Isaac de la Peyrère, who wrote a book called The Pre-Adamites. And he basically says, look, the story of the Bible of Adam and Noah and all this stuff is actually not a global story. This is a story of a specific area that's not actually the story of the entirety of humanity. It's a one tribe. And he actually makes points that are from the Bible. He says, look, in the story of Cain and Abel and Adam and stuff, after Cain kills Abel, he goes off and marries these other people. He goes to like this other people. So if they're who are those other people? If Adam is the first man and these are the only people in the world, like who are these other people that Abel goes off and settles with? So he basically points out that the Bible is not a global history. It's a local history. Things like the flood of Noah was not a global flood. It was a local flood that just destroyed the area that Noah was in. A new cosmology. Think about in the 17th century, Galileo's discovery of, using rudimentary telescopes, being able to see the moons of Jupiter rotating, and this idea of the Copernican idea of heliocentrism, that the Earth is not the center of the cosmos, but in fact it rotates around the sun. Explodes the kind of classical cosmology that both Muslims and Western European Christian Europe had used. A new perspective on new peoples. This idea of that if you're going to say that, and again, for Muslims, this isn't really a difficulty because we have the notion of the people of Ahl al-Fatra, and that God sends prophets to everybody in the world, and that there are some people who live in times and places when prophecy is weakened or vanished. But for Europeans, they had this really difficult time making sense of how to judge these Native American tribes that they come across, because how can they be faulted for not being Christian, right? How can they be faulted for not being Christian? And then, of course, they'll note that they often have really like sensible moral systems, that they actually have developed societies and they have morality, and there's things that are very even noble and admirable about them. And here you kind of combine this with the rediscovery of the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition, and then you have this reemphasis on the idea that the real way humans know truth is not through scripture, not through revelation, but through their mind. That's where both the American savage who's never had exposure to prophecy, and the kind of European or whatever philosopher, whether that's before or after Christianity, they all access truth through their mind. And so the human mind can realize that there's only one God, right? And that there's right and wrong, and what right and wrong is made of. And you see this writing, especially in the 1600s, with a group of writers, especially in England, known as the Deists, people like John Toland, who have this idea, you've all been exposed to it, that yes, there is a God, but God kind of creates the world and sets it in motion and doesn't engage in prophecy. There's not like the tradition of prophecy is not really reliable, but that human reason is enough to grasp this truth about God. And that's combined with the idea that, okay, well, what happens is, humans have this innate rational ability to know God and to know what's right and wrong, but then you get the church, in this case, in case of Christianity, the Roman culture kind of comes and perverts and corrupts Christian teachings. That the real rational philosophical teachings of Christianity perverts them and turns it into this like product of Roman superstition, right? So, in a lot of ways, the medieval religious culture of Europe is a product of these forces that are corrupting and perverting our actual philosophical innate understanding of what the real truth is, which is that there's just this God that we should worship, and that we have these basic moral things about like not stealing, not killing, but that's all graspable by reason.
Can I
All
just
right.
come in and say that? Could you 10
10
minutes?
minutes?
Yeah, I will do my level best. I think this is. I'll do my best. Okay. So Protestant Reformation, very important. End of the church control of interpretation. So after the Protestant Reformation, with the fact that all these princes and states in Germany and some people in France and England basically say, we're not under control of the Catholic Church anymore. We're going to engage in our own interpretation of the Bible. And we're no longer confined to what the Catholic Church says is the canon of the New Testament or the Old Testament. They discovered, for example, there's all these other gospels that were known in the early church by the early church fathers, like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas and things like that. And some of them they discovered through Greek writings that they received through the Byzantine tradition. And not only that, but they were now free to interpret the Bible as they saw fit. They were no longer controlled by the church. The Bible, and what this ends up with is a concept of the Bible as a product of a specific time and worldview, not primarily a vessel of truth. Again, go back and think about that notion of, the Bible is a local history, not a universal history. That the Bible is a product of certain people in a certain place. Like, for example, the Old Testament is something that's produced by and for a group of Semitic nomads living in like the Holy Land, right? It's not something that has truth for all time. This is important. That Martin Luther, you can see on the right, he has this idea that if the church no longer defines the correct understanding of Scripture, of the Bible, how do you know you read the Bible properly? Well, you know it because the Holy Spirit is inside you and the Holy Spirit guides your reading. Now, that is, no offense, a very bad idea, right? Because anybody can say they have the Holy Spirit inside them, right? There's no way to check people's understanding. But this continues with for example, the Quaker Church, which is founded in the 1600s, the Society of Friends. And here, they're actually some of the most critical, the most skeptical figures about the textual integrity of the Bible. So go back and think about Erasmus's criticism of the New Testament. Some early Quakers engage in even more serious criticism of the New Testament, showing how there's lots of elements of the text which were altered over time, which are unreliable. But it doesn't matter, because if you're Quaker, your real connection to Christ and your real connection to truth is not the Bible, it's the inner light. It's the inner light of Jesus speaking through you. So once you get this idea of the kind of Holy Spirit guiding you, Scripture can actually get demoted. And if you combine that with criticism of the Scripture and this notion that it kind of comes out of a specific time, you can see that there's this movement away from Scripture. Calvin, another founding figure of the Protestant tradition, John Calvin in Geneva, he again says, we shouldn't read the Bible from the perspective of Aristotelian philosophy or kind of Catholic Church teachings. You read the Bible as it was in its own context. You read it, as it was supposed to be understood by its original audience. All right. What does this result in? This results in Germany, and just the kind of main place where it happens, also England and France, but mostly in Germany, in the 1700s and 1800s, with certain developments. If you take the idea that truth from outside of Scripture, so truth comes from reason, truth comes from Yeah, so primarily from reason, the locality of scripture, the corruption of scripture over time, gives you the result that the Bible is no longer the font of truth. The Bible is an interesting document, but the real, it can inspire you, make you feel good, but the real sources of truth are outside it. And this you see in the writing of a very famous, his family was Jewish, but his family converted to Christianity, although he was later declared a heretic. Um, Benedict Spinoza, who lived in Amsterdam and died in 1677. If you want to read a fascinating book by him, very influential, read the Theological Political Treatise, which is available in English. Another really important development is having figured all this stuff out. It gives you this enormous sense of superiority and kind of confidence. So there's this famous, he's a scholar of classical literature, F.A. Wolf, a German scholar. And in 1795, he publishes this study of the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer. And what he says is, there was no Homer. There was no, the person who wrote the Odyssey and the person who wrote the Iliad was not the same person. And again, how does he do this? He says that the textual style, the literary style of these two books is not the same. And what's interesting is previous scholars, so going back to like the 2nd century BC in places like Alexandria, Greek scholars had known that there were certain elements in the Iliad and the Odyssey that had been changed or that needed to be reread or that were inappropriate or something, but they never occurred to them. They never had the confidence or the sense of arrogance, I guess you might say, to say, oh, so there's no one author. Like, it's just this sense of, based on your conclusions, to question and undermine or to call into doubt and reject serious like tenets of your cultural and religious tradition. Another figure is a German scholar named Hermann Reimarus, who actually, these fragments were published after he died because they were very controversial in his time, but they kind of sowed seeds that became much more accepted in the 1800s. And he writes that basically a lot of stuff about Jesus was made up by the disciples, that they thought the world was about to end. When it didn't, they had to kind of touch up details of his life, that a lot of things like the miracles they say Jesus did were just their own misperceptions or their own inventions. If you are in a situation where now the Bible as a text, even Christian doctrine over time has been called into question, what does this mean if you're Christian? Well, the way this is navigated is primarily by a move away from the idea of the historical Jesus, the actual details of early church history, the actual, details of church teachings. That's not really important. What's really important is the kind of spirit of Jesus. It's not about the Bible. It's about what kind of person does this make you? That's kind of the most important aspect of Christianity. This you can see in the works of an important historian, theologian named Johann Zemler, a German. Very important. Remember, for most of Western European history, theology, the study of the Bible and theology, is the most important thing. That's like ilm for them, right? Just like in Islam, it's the study, the basic is study of Quran, Sunnah of the Prophet, and the Sharia, theology, kalam, right? That's the most important thing. These things are completely inverted. Theology is now the object of study. It's a thing you examine scientifically as a historian. Now, history is the main study, and everything else in your tradition becomes an object of study of history and of historians. You can look at figures like Edward Gibbon, who wrote his famous Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. If you want to read this, I really recommend you read it. It's 3 fat volumes. The first volume and a half are really, I think, the most important part, but it is an incredibly interesting read. It's an incredibly interesting read. You can see in him a kind of revival of a Ciceronian Greco-Roman historian, right? Things like miracles, he doesn't believe in. Using things like the principle of uniformitarianism, principle of anachronism, right? Principle of dissimilarity. Why, for example, does he believe that Allahumma salli Muhammad, like in Tacitus, he's a second century Roman historian. He has a story of, Christian involvement in fires or something, right, in the fires in Rome during the time of Nero. He believes it. Why? He says, look, uh, why would you make this up? Like, people wouldn't make this up. If you're a Christian, post-Christianity, post-Constantine scholar, you're not going to have Christians fingered as the culprits in this fire. Whereas, so he sort of like uses principle of dissimilarity there. And this notion that human nature, that's how you can tell what happened in the past, because people in the past act like us. And they're kind of cynical, they're selfish, they're self-centered. It's a very cynical view towards history. Is very evident in Edward Gibbon. Kind of a supercilious, haughty sense that he's above everything, that everything is kind of silly in the world. And the kind of historian looks and surveys this with a sense of amusement in a way. That study of the material world and skepticism about dogmatic claims, skepticism about metaphysics, ends up kind of getting perverted in the 1700s and 1800s with into what is maybe best understood as a kind of crass materialism. So it's really interesting. A lot of the most important scientific figures of the 1600s and the 1700s are super pious Christians. People like Blaise Pascal, died 1662. People like Robert Boyle, right? People like Bernoulli. These people are not just Christian; they're super pious Christians. They're more Christian than other people around them. In fact, in the 1700s, there's no real atheists or deists who are major scientists. The major scientists are all really Christian. Why is that? It's interesting. How does that work? What they do is they say, look, our belief is not subject to reason, but this world is totally subject to reason and observation. So they turn all their attention to studying things in this world, which has no relation to their belief. Now that could have continued, but what ends up happening is, instead of having a veneration for the other, the al-akhirah or the ghaib, instead of having a veneration for the unseen and an interest in this world, you get the idea that the unseen is stupid and doesn't exist, and all that matters is this world. That's the crass materialism you see written by figures like Denis Diderot, the famous French editor of the great encyclopedia in the 18th century, and people like Voltaire as well. Finally, really important thing, the idea of progress. I cannot emphasize this enough. Human beings, whether they're Muslim or European or whatever, did not think about the world in terms of progress prior to the Renaissance. It's really only in the 1500s and 1600s, and then really it kind of becomes much more pronounced in the 1800s. The idea that things are getting better. And this is very, very important. This is in some ways the god of the secular humanists, is the progress of the human race itself. The god of secular humanists today is progress, and the idea that the future is going to be better. Things are always, think about like the Star Trek view of history, that we're slowly getting better, and we're proceeding to a point where eventually we'll be this enlightened race that doesn't have war or hatred or anything like that. The idea that through knowledge and scientific discovery around us, you can control the world. You can make the world subservient to you and learn everything and kind of transcend conflict, transcend war, et cetera, et cetera. This continues even though we have 2 world wars and lots of other things that suggest this is not the case. I wanted to show you just an example of, and then I'll be done, an example of how this actually works in the study of the Islamic tradition. Now, if you guys remember a couple of years ago, there was the Birmingham Quran debate. There are these pages from a mushaf that were in the Birmingham University Library, and there was carbon testing done on them, and the carbon testing put them between 668 and 645. And the first, some people were saying this was actually like during the time of the early caliphates. Okay, now this is actually an article written by a Western scholar who teaches at University of Notre Dame named Gabriel Said Reynolds. I think his family is Lebanese Christian. And I want you to think about this, right? the idea here is when does the Quran originate? So the general prior to this, a lot of historians who are really skeptical of Islamic history said that the Quran was a later, later construct that was put together in like the 700s or even 800s of the Common Era. Things like this radiocarbon dating and a lot of other early Quranic pages that have been found really put a rest to this. But now look what happens. The fact that the date is 568 to 645. Gabriel Said Reynolds writes, the upshot of all these early dates is that the Quran may very well date earlier than Uthman, perhaps much earlier. Ooh, what does that mean? It may be time to rethink the origins of the Quran's, or think the story of the Quran's origins. Sorry. It may be time to rethink the story of the Quran's origins, including the traditional date of Muhammad's career. So I want you to think about this, right? What is the Muslim claim? The Muslim claim is that the Quran comes from the time of the Prophet. So 610 to 632, and then around 650, the Caliph Uthman promulgates the official version of the Quran. So 610 to 650. Well, that's the claim. Now, think about this. Why is that so hard to believe? You can believe that and still be an atheist. You can say this was all made up. Muhammad wrote it himself. Someone else wrote it. I don't know. You can be an atheist. You can deny its divine revelation. You can do whatever you want. But the only claim being made here is that it comes from this time period. But note, it's just that can't be accepted. Either it has to be a lot later, or now if we get these dates, it must come from earlier. In fact, maybe it comes from before the life of the Prophet. Here's a quote from, or I wrote this in one of my articles. I just pasted it here for you to see. A number of scholars who have interest in early Islamic history, particularly the popular author Tom Holland, have stated that the carbon dating of the Birmingham Quran pages suggests that the Quran actually predates the life of Muhammad. In fact, he argues it suggests that the Quran dates from a good deal before Muhammad's career. Just think about this, right? That these people are saying is either the Quran is much later invention, or it comes from before what we think Islam's origins are. But it can't come from the time that Muslims say it comes from. Why is that unacceptable to these people? And this is why you have to understand the psychology, the mindset that comes out of the historical critical method and its origins. Orthodoxy is a later creation. So whatever the religion officially says is not the original story. It's a later creation. You discover the original story by going back, looking at early texts, using the principle of uniformitarianism, using the principle of analogy, using anachronism, right? Using principle of dissimilarity, and then you figure out what the real story is. So whatever Islam says, whatever Muslims are saying, can't be true. It can't be true because that's not how religions work. You're going to go and uncover the real origins. So what that means is there's just this refusal to accept that the Muslim narrative about the Quran's origins are true. Even though there's nothing, again, you can be an atheist, you can deny the prophet of Muhammad, all these things. All the Muslims are saying is the Quran comes from the mid 7th century. That's it. But that's just unacceptable to some Western scholars who really are controlled and whose kind of worldview is suffused by the historical critical method and its origins. Okay, that's all I will say to you.
Jazakallah khair.
I don't know how long I went over, but anyway.
I think we're good. I think what we'll do is I hope Dr. Yaqub doesn't mind this, and Dr. Wayman, we'll take about 20 minutes for specific Q&A with your whatever, because there's a few questions and answers and stuff. Okay, I guess a good question, and one I think a sister did sort of come up with. I'm gonna take her question and slightly switch it up, so I'll put it here. She asks, is there a difference between the principle of dissimilarity and objectivity? And I guess my question off the back of this then is, when you mention uniformitarianism and dissimilarity and anachronism and all of these things, they don't sound too bad. They sound like good history. They sound like they make sense in a lot of the ways that if you just sit back and look at them and think, okay, that could work, and maybe the history that comes out of that could be quite honest and truthful. Why are they not such a good thing? And then what is the equivalent of them in the Islamic tradition, if there is anything?
Yeah, so Muslims actually have a very similar rule, and you can find it in, you know, let's just say books like Khatib Baghdadi's writings in the 1000s. You can see this very clearly, which is that one of the ways you know a report, any historical report, hadith or whatever, anything, and one of the ways you know it's false is that if it describes something that if it had actually happened, many more people would have transmitted it, right? So,
Umum
um,
al-balwa, right?
right, so that's a good. So if you know, if a spaceship comes down over High Wycombe today, and only and like, you know, it's lights flashing and zapping people and stuff like that, and only Don Wacky reports this, right? Then that's not possible. This is not true because other people would have seen it, right? Um,
Right.
or Big Wacky too. These are other people I met in High Wycombe. So uh, that's a sensible rule, right? But here's the problem, right? The problem is when you combine that with an obsession with the idea that orthodoxy is created and that the real origins are always being covered up with like the official version of the religion's history. So, for example, um, why are Muslim scholars so skeptical of the story of the satanic verses? For example, like Qadi Iyad in his Kitab al-Shifa, Qadi Iyad died 544, 1149, Common Era, right? Great scholar. He says, look, this story is only transmitted by very few, one main chain transmission. If this had happened, right? So imagine the Prophet actually changes the revelation. So Shaitan comes, like, what are his enemies sitting around? They're sitting around being like, you're making this up. Someone's telling you about this. You're getting this from some other source. Da, 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 this is poetry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is the main criticism they have is to like attack the Quran and where it's coming from. And then you just have one kind of very narrow report about this. If this had happened, it would be massively transmitted, right? So, but Western scholars say they kind of take the opposite approach. They say, why if Muslims believe the Quran is the word of God, why would they make this story up? If they didn't make this story up, it has to be true because it makes Islam look bad. But here's the problem. God knows why people do stuff. Okay. God knows why people do stuff. Just think about your own life. Sometimes you have to tell a story and someone's like, why did the guy do that? You're like, I don't know why I did that. I'm not sure why I did this. Or, when you're explaining to your wife, like why you didn't get something at the store. Like, I don't know. I can't remember. Well, you were in that aisle. Why didn't you get it? It's like, I don't know. I mean, it's inconceivable. It's inconceivable that you wouldn't have done this. Look, people are complicated. Just for example, there's a story in the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq. And I'm going to tell you this, just for FYI, Muslim scholars said this story is complete nonsense. It gets excised from Ibn Hisham's version of Ibn Ishaq's Sirah because it's total hooey. But here's the story. The story is that Salman al-Farsi, this is in like Ibn Ishaq's official Sirah that he wrote and under the patronage of the Abbasid Caliph. Salman al-Farsi says, before I came to Medina, I was traveling around the Middle East looking for the true religion. This guy tells me, go to this bush in Syria. There are these two bushes, and there's a wise man who lives in the bush. And once a year, he runs from one bush to the other bush. You got to go get him and ask him, what's the true religion? So Salman does this. He goes, finds the guy. The guy runs between the bushes. He grabs and says, hey, what's the true religion? The guy says, okay, listen, go to Medina because there's going to be a prophet there. That's where you need to go. And then the prophet hears the story. Alayhi hears the story allegedly from Salman. He says, you know who that was? That was Jesus. So that means Jesus, according to this story, Jesus is living in a bush in Syria in like 610 Common Era. Does that accord with any notion of Islam that there's no religion, not Christianity, not Islam. Nobody believes this. What the heck is going on? So why would this be? So wait a second. Why would Muslims make this up? It must be true then. Except no one's going to believe that story. But why would it be in this book? Because Lord knows why people make things up sometimes. How can we go and get into their head and know that maybe there was like one guy in the Caliph's quote is like, God, Ibn Ishaq, just put the story in there. I really like this story. I own these bushes. If you do this, my real estate's going to skyrocket. Who knows why? It's a ludicrous story. So that my point is, you don't know this, but if you combine this principle of dissimilarity, if you stick with it like with dogmatic fierce ferocity, and you combine it with constant skepticism of the official story, it can lead you astray. Does that answer that person's question? I think it does.
No, it does. It does, and I think it answers this brother's question as well. Are exclusive to the West these HCM principles? Could you share if there are some analogous principles, analogous maybe even, that emerged in traditional Islamic scholarship? And you did, because you're not beholden to any of these single principles in the way you mentioned in dogmatic sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because Muslim scholars will use this a lot in things like not just in historical reports, but in things about fiqh, like if you lock someone up for 3 days, if someone says they're bankrupt and they don't have any money to pay a debt, and then you like stick them in jail for 3 days, it's like if that person's like a rich person who's used to being comfortable, they're still say they don't have any money, they don't have any money. Like that's not how people. So they're actually, Muslims are constantly using this idea of kind of that there are general ways that people act, but they wouldn't say they're universal. They'd say that they often are very based on culture and based on class, which I think is actually a lot more accurate. A lot more accurate. Like it's very difficult, for example, for people in the West to understand like why a Muslim would like, why would you die because someone insulted the prophet? Like, why would you go and like risk your life? Like the guy who killed Salman Taseer in Pakistan. Like, why would this guy do that? Like, doesn't make sense, because guess what? People are different, and they're motivated by different things. Like, they're not everybody is, like an urban American or urban Englishman in the 21st century. That's just not how the world works.
Right.
Yeah. So another thing, but I would say it's important to keep in mind that Muslim scholars, when it comes to hadiths, there's an issue, which is that prophets are not subject to normal rules. So if I say, guys, I just had a dream and God told me that, you guys should do this, I'd be like, that's great. Thank you very much. Right. But if someone's a prophet, they actually can have revelation. They can see the future. They
So
can
that's
know more than regular people know. Right. So if once you conclude that someone's a prophet, a lot of the normal rules of historical critical method no longer apply to that person.
right, because and then like that whole notion of uniformitarianism, if I'm saying
Exactly.
it correctly, that's gone flying out the window
Exactly.
now.
Right. So, you can't. Why does the prophet, for example, unable to lie about God? Because if he could lie about God, it's inconceivable that prophecy would function.
Right.
Right? So,
Well, yeah.
but I mean,
He's
you'll
actually
see
agreed, right?
I mean, I was just the other day. I mean, this is controversial, but I was just reading in a book. Qadi Iyad's son wrote about his father, the guy who wrote the Kitab al-Shifa. He says that this guy said that there was this saint in Al-Andalus, and he was in the desert, and he sees this big meal of bread and milk and water is like made for him in the desert. And Qadi Iyad, I can't remember the scholar that Qadi Iyad is talking about. It's not Qadi Iyad himself, but the scholar he's talking about. He doesn't believe this story. So that's not true, because even the Prophet ﷺ and the companions of the Prophet didn't get this kind of treatment. They didn't. When they were hungry, they suffered, and they weren't suddenly like massive meals weren't brought for them. So I'm not saying that this scholar is right or wrong. I'm just saying that you can see Muslim scholars will constantly be using this notion of the way things work generally as a tool, as a tool of discernment in reports about the past.
Okay, so you brought forward an example of the HCM in application and how it failed. So that was Gabriel Said Reynolds talking about the Birmingham manuscript. And now there's quite a few instances, and obviously one of them is slightly more prominent than others, which was obviously Dr. Shadi al-Masri had a debate with somebody about the believer's hypothesis. But I want to, because okay, I'll give another example of HCM, and I think this one's good because it relates to a lot of the work you've done. So I went to is it on New Lines magazine or something? So I went and found that article, which is Javed Hashmi's article from New Lines magazine, where he quotes a guy called Joshua Little. So I think you know where I'm going to go with this, right? So and you're in the article, like you're mentioned, your critique of the HCM is mentioned. Right, exactly. So he says, basically, okay, I'll put forward, they say that the hadith of Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, being the age that the Muslims claim she is in the traditional narrative, is fabricated because Hisham ibn Urwa narrates it, he's mudallis. They all come something about Iraq, and Iraq is a big problem. It's not in the Muwatta of Imam Malik, so why isn't it being mentioned in Medina? So all I'm doing is they're putting forward these like different fragments of evidence,
So
and they've put. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So the general, the idea is there's this report. It's fairly widespread. It's in Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and other books like that. Aisha was radiallahu ta'ala anha was 9 when the Prophet consummated his marriage with her. Now this really disturbs people. This disturbs me, right? I mean, I would love it. I would love it if this hadith was unreliable and we don't have to worry about it, because that would, this basically, if you live in most parts of the world today, this story is going to creep you out, right? It's going to, and I've met Muslims who are literally like, I cannot accept the story. If it's either I'm not Muslim anymore or I reject the story, I'm going to reject the story because otherwise I can't be Muslim. Like that's how strong their reaction is to this, right? Now, here's the thing. Nobody ever talked about this, right? So the Prophet's enemies that are sitting around in Mecca and Medina, like, oh, what's this Zaynab thing? Like literally they go, let's do. We know that they talk about, they're trying to use his life against him. They're going to use even his married life against him. Even when you look at early polemics like John of Damascus and early non-Muslims or Christian polemicists writing against Islam, they'll talk about the Prophet's age of marriage to Aisha, but they don't mention her age. They say, oh, he became obsessed with Aisha and he had this vision of his dream of her and he used revelation to get her. But they don't talk about her age. It's not until, interestingly, the first, I'd found one in 1905 was the first instance, but then actually somebody mentioned to me, and I saw this, that Mirza Ghulam Ahmed in the late, I think in the 1890s also addresses this. So in the but the same thing, basically the late 19th century is when this starts to become a big deal. I mean, it becomes a deal at all. Why is that? Because prior to that time in Britain and America, for example, people were marrying young girls all the time because people didn't care about age. Like it didn't matter. Think about this. If your kid wasn't in school and there's not like first grade, second grade, or first year, third year, second year, right? Kids just running around. Hey, that kid looks big. That kid looks small. Like the small kid's going to play with the small kids. The big kid's going to play with the big kids. Like you don't even know what age they are. It doesn't matter. Like age is irrelevant. Somebody goes through puberty and another person doesn't go to puberty. You don't sit there and be like, wait, but they're both 14. I don't understand, right? So this idea of thinking about people's age is really a product of the modern state, and it's the school system, public schooling, everybody being sorted by age, putting with their age peers. This is a very new way to think about human society. So prior to this, like if you went and you saw like a really nubile, attractive girl, and you'd be like, oh, wow, she's really attractive. Maybe I would like to marry her. And what does it matter if she's 13 or 18? It's that the point is that's of no importance to people, right? There's a lot of stuff written on this. A good book by Starrett called American Child Bride. You can read if you're interested in this. So my point is that imagine that 1400 years of people trying to attack the Prophet's personality, and they never bring up Aisha's age. Until now, suddenly we've discovered the hadith is made up because we feel this need. We feel this need. But here's the thing. I talked about the historical critical method is suspicious towards certain things and certain people, but not other things. Imagine this. Here's a hadith. The Prophet, ﷺ, went outside one day and had some dates with him and then got on his camel. I mean, in theory, you could be critical of that, but I mean, if you're critical of that, you don't really have anything to build on. Like there's no background against which to be critical because you have to be critical of everything, right? It doesn't make that there's no reason to be critical of this report. The Prophet went
Okay.
out and like ate the dates and got on his camel. Okay. Here's the problem. That story about Aisha's age is the same. Like that was unremarkable. It was unremarkable. Where's the evidence? Like, let's say other reports. The Prophet, salam, oh, here we go. He wrote a treaty. This is going to be a big debate. Wait a second. I thought the Prophet can't write. What do you mean he wrote a treaty? This is Muslim scholars would debate this, right? Or the Prophet, salam, said, Allahumma salli Muhammad. Like the Prophet, he said Abu Bakr should be the caliph after me, or Ali should be the caliph after me. We're going to debate this, right? So there's the things that people debated. They didn't debate this. There's no like dispute over Aisha's age that we know of. If there were, then you could say maybe, yeah. So one group is kind of going to make this hadith up because they're trying to spin some message about Aisha or about the Prophet, but there's no debates. Okay,
Is there? I mean, just
here's,
on a
here's,
side.
I'll tell you.
I,
So I read
okay.
Joshua Little.
Something little.
I feel bad. I'm forgetting because I actually think he's a nice guy. I mean, I think his name is. I feel bad. Jay, I'm really bad. I apologize. Either James or Joshua. I apologize. And his dissertation is very thorough work. And
It's Joshua Little. Yes.
yeah, Joshua. Okay, I don't feel that bad. Then. So I laud him for his overall work. But I said this to him in private messages. I disagree with certain presumptions he has, which are presumptions of the historical critical method. So, for example, his argument is that, so Hisham bin Urwa is a problematic narrator. So let's actually forget about Hisham bin Urwa's reports. There's still a report in Sahih Muslim that goes from Abdurrazzaq Sanani to Ma'mar bin Rashid to Zuhri to Urwa bin Zubair about his aunt Aisha, talking about her own age. So that's a Sahih chain of transmission, which does not involve, and again, this is just saying I was 9 years old when the Prophet married me. And again, if you had a one chain of transmission in Sahih Muslim, by the way, it goes back to Abdurrazzaq Sanani, whose work is in general also reliable. Like a lot of Western historians, like, by the way, a lot of Western historians like G.H. Yoinbol, people like Sean Anthony, they actually accept the report of Aisha's age, right? So this is not like all the Orientalists think this. So there's some Western scholars who don't agree with the report, some who do agree with the report. But imagine, if you have a sound chain transmission that says the Prophet got on his camel one day and ate some dates, no one's going to dispute that. What's the difference between this Aisha report and something about eating dates and getting on a camel? For most of Islamic history until essentially the last century, this was the same. These were the same level of unremarkability. Whatever. Now it becomes an issue. So if only now we're having an issue, doesn't that raise suspicions about whether or not this is really something that should be debated? But here's why. Okay, if you could find some reason, some conflict in which this was manufactured, then you'd have grounds for criticizing the reliability of the hadith. But here's the problem. There's no conflict. So what Little says is that there was there was one Zoroastrian opinion that's in Zoroastrian law that said that the minimum, you shouldn't marry a girl before she's 9. Okay. And then in this 10th century Shiite collection called the Usul al-Kafi of al-Kulaini, who dies 940 of the Common Era. Okay, it has a report attributed to Jafar as-Sadiq where he talks about the Prophet about not marrying girls who are younger than 9. Not the Prophet, you shouldn't marry girls younger than 9. Okay, so what's that? That argument means that there's this debate where Shiites are trying to say stuff about like purity and being 9. And so Sunni Muslims make up this report about Aisha being 9. I mean, okay, but here's the problem. And I asked him this question. I said, why do you accept the report in Kulaini's Usul al-Kafi? Like Kulaini died in this guy's living in the late 800s, early 900s of the Common Era. Why? I mean, this report about Aisha definitely goes back a lot earlier. I mean, if you're saying Hisham bin Urwa made it up, let's just say he made it up. This guy's living in the early mid 700s. So, I mean, that's a lot earlier. And you're telling me that there's another book in the early 900s that now I'm supposed to use as like evidence? But I thought the whole problem with Islamic sources is that they're late. People can make things up. Like, why didn't this guy make stuff up? Right? Or how about this? So we subject the Hadith of Aisha's age to this insanity, incredibly degree of skepticism. But then the report from Kulaini is just accepted because what? Because it goes along with our argument. Then the second problem is, imagine this. Let's say, and I don't want anyone to misquote me and then do another thing where poor Asim gets in trouble because of something I say. But imagine this. Imagine that the Prophet ﷺ actually is influenced by Zoroastrian law. Like imagine that, like there's Christian ideas and Jewish ideas and Zoroastrian ideas floating around Arabia. He says, oh, there's a Zoroastrian law that you can marry girls at 9. I think I should marry Aisha. Like, just imagine that. That's okay, fine. That's what happened. Like, but why does that mean that the story about Aisha is made up? Maybe like the fact that Muslims are influenced by the world around them it's not surprising, right? So my point is that there's all sorts of ways to interpret this evidence that does not come up with this conclusion that the story about Aisha's age is made up. Again, I actually wish the story about Aisha's age were made up because that would make life a lot easier for all of us. But the problem is if you constantly readjust your understanding of your religion based on whatever the thing that people are most recently upset about, you're constantly going to be changing your view of the world. Like there's no, you're not actually following anything true. You're just following a manufactured, product that's designed to please current consumers. So, again, if there's an existing dispute or a good reason to criticize a hadith, I don't think any Muslim scholar has a problem with that. But coming with a relatively recent social anxiety and saying that this should make us go back and reinterpret something from 1400 years ago, that was a bad argument.
On this principle of dissimilarity, I was just thinking, are there instances where are there instances where hadith is probably beneficial for Islam if it were true, and the Muslim scholars still came out and said, actually, that's fabricated?
Yeah, tons.
Loads, of course. So maybe
tons. Like the hadith of the hidden jewel. I mean, Ibn Arabi likes this hadith. He says he has this evidence for it through Kashf, that Allah says that I was a hidden jewel and I wanted to be known, so I created the world and it knew me. It's a really interesting idea. Maybe it's true, but there's no isnad for it. Like there's no isnad for it at all. Mullah Ali al-Qari, who died in 1606, 1606, he says that he thinks he kind of comes up with evidence that has similar meaning, but that hadith definitely is no isnad for it. Like the idea, utlubul ilm walau bis-Sin, seek knowledge even in China. How many times have we cited this? Like, it's a weak hadith. I mean, maybe it's not a forgery, but it's a weak hadith. There are so many examples. And like Ibn Taymiyyah says, he has a great line. He says, look, there's lots of things can be true. It doesn't mean that the Prophet said it. Like, something can be a great thing to say. It doesn't mean the Prophet necessarily said it. And it can be also really good. You don't have to forget about it just because the Prophet didn't say it.
No, that's okay. So, and I'll finish with a couple of questions, and then maybe I'll bring everybody else in for the final rundown. This is, I think, quite an interesting question. I don't know if this person knows you. I don't know. I always feel like only people who know you call you Jack, but okay.
It's okay.
To what extent and potentially how is Jack, i.e., Dr. Jonathan Brown's critique of HCM shared by other scholars within Western academia? Can he or others share any writings on the matter? I think that's an interesting question. Like this, how dominant is this the HCM as an idea even within the secular paradigm? Because you mentioned even Sean Anthony and people like that accept the Hadith of Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha. So then,
He says he's inclined to accept it. I don't think he fully accepts it, but he definitely is inclined to accept it. So it's a tough. I don't you don't find this very often because people who it's like saying, are there a lot of Muslims who reject, the authenticity of the Quran or something? And no, there's not, because that's not what Muslims tend to think, right? So if you come from a Western historical background, you this is like the water you swim in. Um, in addition, if you're a citizen of the global Western society, it's your cultural background in a lot of ways. So it's very rare to find people questioning it. You do see it sometimes from maybe more pious, more like practicing Christians will talk about it in a kind of defense of their own tradition. So that's where you'll see it, like more kind of seminarian scholars, Christian scholars will usually sometimes be a little more skeptical about some of these things.